turn to Washington's other power broker, the man who leads the Senate. Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has been working closely with the president at the White House and at the Republican retreat in Philadelphia this week, where the GOP mapped out its agenda for the year. Majority Leader McConnell joins us now. Nice to see you this morning,
Good morning.
Leader McConnell. Do you support President Trump's temporary immigration ban from these predominantly Muslim countries?
Well, I think it's a good idea to tighten the vetting process, but I also think it's important to remember that some of our best sources in the war against radical Islamic terrorism are Muslims, both in this country and overseas. And we have had some difficulty in the past getting interpreters, as you suggested in the earlier segment, who are helpful to us, treated properly. So we need to be careful as we do this. Improving vetting is something.
And yet, right now, they're being detained. So,
well, it's going to ultimately be decided.
It's going to
ultimately be decided in the courts as to whether or not this has gone too far. I don't want to criticize them for improving vetting. I think we need to be careful. We don't have religious tests in this country.
In the past, you've called a Muslim ban completely and totally inconsistent with American values. While the president says this is not an outright Muslim ban, even if this is temporary, how is this order consistent with American values?
Well, if they're looking to tighten the vetting process, I mean, who would be against that? But I am opposed to religious tests. The courts are going to determine whether this is too broad.
So it sounds to me like you are opposed to certain parts of this. If we're detaining or holding back people who have helped Americans in the fight,
well, obviously I'm against that.
A religious test, then you're opposed to certain parts of this.
Look, the president has a lot of latitude to try to secure the country, and I'm not going to make a blanket criticism of this effort. However, I think it's important to remember, as I said, a lot of Muslims are our best sources in the war against terror.
So do you think this will have blowback?
Well, we'll see.
In the world? I mean, Are you sensing that already? You've seen the reaction.
Yeah, well, we'll see. And it's important, however, to emphasize it's important to keep America as secure as possible, and we'll see how it plays out.
Just tell me again how you would summarize what happened with this executive order.
How I would summarize
Yes. How would you... What would you say about it? Others are saying it's devastating. Others are saying it's un-American.
Well, I'm not saying either of those things. I'm saying what I just said a few minutes ago, which is that to the extent that they're trying to improve the vetting process, I think that's in order. We need to bear in mind that we don't have religious tests in this country, and we also need to remember that some of our best allies in the war against Islamic terrorism are Muslims.
I want to turn to Russia. President Trump hasn't ruled out the possibility of lifting sanctions on Russia. You heard what Sean Spicer just said. Would you like him to see the sanctions lifted?
I'm opposed to lifting the sanctions against Russia. They were imposed because of their annexation of Crimea, their incursion into Ukraine, and now we know that they were messing around in our elections. I'm absolutely opposed to lifting sanctions on the Russians. If anything, we ought to be looking at increasing them.
Should Congress take any action to prevent the president from lifting sanctions on Russia if he chooses to do so?
Well, we'll wait to see. I hope the president will follow our advice and not be lifting sanctions on the Russians.
Do you think that, I asked Sean Spicer this, that they should just tell now whether or not they're going to lift them?
You mean the administration?
Yes.
Well, the president's taking a look at it. I'm giving him my advice publicly that I would not consider, if I were in his shoes, lifting sanctions on the Russians for what they've been doing the last few years.
And the move in the National Security Council to have Steve Bannon in there, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, out, the DNI out in certain cases.
Yeah, I'm not going to give the president advice about how to run these internal agencies.
Not at all.
No, I'm not. I'm not going to give him advice about that.
Okay. On the Supreme Court, President Trump says he's announcing the Supreme Court nominee on Thursday. He has said that if Democrats try to filibuster, he'd encourage you to invoke the so-called nuclear option and lower the 60-vote threshold currently needed to confirm Supreme Court nominees. So will you consider getting rid of the filibuster?
Well, look, let me tell you what ought to happen. President Clinton, in his first term, had two Supreme Court nominees, Ginsburg and Breyer. there was no filibuster. For your listeners, there was no requirement that you get 60 votes to consider them. President Obama had 2 Supreme Court nominees in his first term. There was no filibuster against them. We're in the first term of a new president. What we're hoping is that our Democratic friends in the minority in the Senate, as we were during those same comparable periods under Clinton and Obama, will treat this nominee in the same way and give him an up or down vote. Cloture, that is, if getting 60 votes is required, that happened with Justice Alito. A Democratic minority insisted on that. Cloture was invoked. In other words, he was given the opportunity to have an up or down vote on the final nomination. So it's way too early for me to tell you or anybody else what we might do. I think how this is handled depends on our Democratic friends. Let me tell you what I do think we're going to get. I think we're going to get a really outstanding nominee who will be very hard to argue against, because the president has been working on this for some time. I'm privy to some of the information about what's been happening, and I think we're going to get a great nominee who will be very difficult to explain to the American people. We're not even going to let them have an up or down vote in the Senate.
Should there be a litmus test on abortion?
I don't think there should be a litmus test on judges, no matter who the president is.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, Leader McConnell. We appreciate you coming in.